welcome. You are listening or watching episode 2 of season 16 of the 2-Month Review, a weekly podcast brought to you by the University of Rochester, open letter. I don't know what the difference is between an open and closed letter exactly, and 3% of something. I'm Professor Chad W. Post, and today we will be discussing the first 75 pages of Roberto Bolaño's final work, 2666. I'm joined on my left by my colleague Brian Wood, who, after receiving an MFA from San
Jose.
Well, same thing. Basically, just surfboard universities, doesn't matter. All the same. Went on to write the short story collection Joy Time Killbox, published by BOA Editions. Also joining me is my much more esteemed colleague, Katie Whittemore, who holds an MA from Middlebury College, an MPhil from Cambridge, which isn't exactly Oxford, but quite respectable, and has gone on to translate and publish 4 novels to date. 4x4 by Sarah Mesa, World's Best Mother by Nuria Labari, The Communist Daughter by Aroa Moreno Duran, and The Last Words on Earth by Javier Serena. Plus, she has 5 novels slated for publication in 2022. I hope you both are doing okay this fine morning and prepared to engage fully and complete with the text at hand. It's our task as fine, upstanding academics to provide the riffraff with intelligent interpretations of literature so they can access the wisdom found within books. Although I must say, I rather agree with Bolaño when he says to the attendees at a literary conference on page 72 in my US edition of 2666, most are what you call rationalists, not in the philosophical sense, but in the pejorative literal sense, denoting people less interested in literature than in literary criticism. The one field, according to them, some of them anyway, where revolution was still possible. So I think we should start with you, Brian. How did it feel to be on a podcast with Katie, who's so much more accomplished than you are sense, and in terms of the volume of her publications?
Well, thank you for first having me on, Chad.
I mean, you barely made the cut. We should make this clear.
I think it's par for the course. My wife has like 19 more degrees than me and publishes much more regularly than I do. So I'm actually right at home, being around people.
Right at home.
Way better than me. So, thank you for keeping me comfortable, actually.
You're welcome. How are you guys doing? I want to do a book about academics.
Good, Professor Post.
But the last thing I want to do is wear a fucking tie. So this is coming off. This makes for good radio. How are you today, Katie?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Pretty okay. I want to start with you actually, because you are rereading this in English for the very first time since you read it in Spanish, and I wondered what you thought of the first 75 pages that we went through for today.
I loved it. I'm loving it this time through as well, and I think that Natasha Wimmer did an incredible job. And yeah, I have read ahead. I have to have a very clear marker here in my book so that I don't give any spoilers, because I'm just like, I can't stop.
What's interesting is that we hit the spoiler. Like it wasn't intentional, but like one of the main spoilers is the last page that we were supposed to read for today, which is perfect. So that's well. Brian, what do you think? This is your first time.
I think it's funny because I feel like it's a book made for people that love books.
Yeah,
if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Borges and Nabokov and Frezan.
I mean, like, obviously, you kind of have to love books if you're going to get into something and like wrestle something this big. It's probably going to weed out folks that really aren't into books.
Yeah.
But if you somehow centered your life around anything literary, this book is for you. And I think people will find themselves or insert themselves with something within the book, and like, he's speaking right to me. Like, there's a connection here that it makes sense why it's so popular.
Right. There is, just so everyone knows that's watching this, on the audio version of the podcast, there will be bonus material at the end of each episode. And this week, there's like a 15-minute discussion with Nick Buzansky, who's a bookseller at Green Apple when 2666 came out, and talks a bit about like the crazy phenomenon of like how this book like crossed the borders of like the really literary nerdy people that we mostly market our books to, and like a broader audience, to the point where like people thought that Bolaño was going to do an event or like be there signing because they had no idea who he was. It was just like the book you were supposed to read.
Yeah.
Kind of fun. So to start, I do actually have a question for both of you that precedes. There's two things that precede actually getting into the book that I thought were interesting. One is the cover itself. So our U.S. editions have the bottom third of this painting by Gustave Moreau. If that's right. But yours doesn't, does it, Katie? What does yours have?
This is mine.
The British one is much simpler.
Yeah.
And much classier. And you don't have the Spanish one with you, but it's like woman, like
The woman
floating in a chair, right?
Yeah.
In like a wasteland, which is very different as well. So I looked up. I didn't know what didn't know what it was. Did you know what this was, Brian?
No, art's bullshit. I don't look at art.
Yeah, art and poetry are the same.
Art and poetry, get out of here. No, I did not look it up, but it's very intriguing. I like it.
So I looked it up. It's by Gustave Moreau. It's Jupiter et Semele. Sure. Okay, and he is a French symbolist who died in 1898. It depicts a moment from the classical myth of the mortal woman Semele, mother of the god Dionysus, and her lover Jupiter, the king of the gods. She was treacherously advised by the goddess Juno, Jupiter's wife, to ask him to appear to her in all his divine splendor. He obliged, but in so doing, brought about her violent death by his divine thunder and lightning. The painting is a representation of the, quote, divinized physical love and the overpowering experience that consumes Semele as the god appears in his extreme beauty, which has been called, quote, quite simply the most sumptuous expression imaginable of an orgasm.
Oh.
Another myth. Female orgasm, that's another myth. Whatever.
Lies.
Which isn't what I expected, but then reading that, it's kind of interesting. So mother of Dionysus dies through thunder and lightning brought about by Zeus/Jupiter as she orgasms. Cool. Okay, so that's something. And then Brian, you were talking about the opening quote. So the Baudelaire quote is an oasis of horror in a desert of boredom. Mm-hmm. And you wanted to point something out about this. So like, turn over to you.
Oh no, because I wanted to read I decided to read the full poem. It's a fantastic poem. Translated in English, it's The Voyage, but definitely worth checking out. But there's quite a few translations of it, obviously. Only a couple say boredom, the rest say ennui.
Yeah.
I think boredom works better for just the little blur, but in the context of the actual poem, the other word works much better.
And it's funny because the French word is ennui.
Yeah,
it's just ennui.
No,
Leave ennui.
Well, I mean, this they choose every word, so they chose boredom instead of ennui.
Yeah, no, and there are some
translations
that have boredom in it. But no, I guess what I found interesting about that, and I think it kind of works with this painting now that you're talking about it, and some of the quotes you talked about earlier, but it has this interesting start in the first stanza about kind of like children and exploration and like the world being wondrous and open. And then what happens if you like set out to sea and chase that, and what happens to your life? And I think it works so perfect with the way these critics start off. Like I was so entranced by that childlike wonder of discovering something for the first time, and then what it does to you. That seems to be like that first kind of movement we get in this book.
Yeah. So the part that we're talking about is the part about the critics, which critics or academics are used interchangeably in the sense because they're like very much academics. And there are four of them in particular. There's Pelletier, who's French, Marini, who's Italian and older and in a wheelchair, Espinosa, who's Spanish, and Liz Norton, who is English and is younger than the other three. They meet at a contemporary literature conference held in Bremen in 1994, and they all are obsessed with Arcimboldi, Benovan Arcimboldi, a mysterious author writing in German with with an Italian sort of pseudonym / strange name that doesn't quite fit. But they all discover his works in different ways and are impacted, like what you say, by this like sense of wonder. And then the four of them, just to give a quick overview summary of the beginning part of this, the four of them become close friends, very close friends, talking all the time about Arcamboldi, doing all their kind of writing and teaming up essentially against other academics, which is funny.
Yes.
Which I have to say, a professor at the U of R read this when it came out and read only that section. Was like, this book is garbage. That's not what academics are like at all. This is nonsense. It's like, okay. Might be proving the points right here. But they all kind of team up on their side of their interpretations and work together and sort of promote each other. And then Pelletier and Espinosa get involved sexually with Liz and have like a relationship with her. And a good section of what we read is sort of navigating that in terms of like where they come together, where they go apart, how that sort of works, and chronicles a lot of their like trips to different conferences. And then there are a few little bit pieces in between that tie in. But you were saying, Brian, oh, it sounds like a joke.
Yeah, doesn't it sound like the setup for a joke?
For critics, for a Spanish. So
Yeah,
there's a
Spanish.
Spaniard, a Frenchman, an Englishwoman, and an Italian.
Yeah.
Go to a German conference.
Go to a German conference.
I know, it does. Well,
no, but it's a fantastic, alluring setup. It's very interesting. Like that first line really kind of twisted and intriguing, because even that, if we read that very first line, how odd and peculiar it is.
I got it.
Go ahead.
The first time that Jean-Claude Pelletier read Benoît van Arcamboldi was Christmas 1980 in Paris when he was 19 years old and studying German literature.
Yeah, there's just this weird, like, wait, who's this person?
Yeah.
What are they doing in France? What is the German? What's this author with the Italian sounding name? Like, it's very curious.
Yeah, I think what I loved about what we've read so far is how, I don't know how he does it exactly. We could talk about sort of the narrative tricks, but he makes this sort of like back and forth, these little European jaunts for a conference or a congress for the weekend. And, the intrigue of the different camps and the theorists on Arcamboldi. And he makes it like so compelling. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because I feel like there's like two layers of narration that are going on right from the jump in the book. And the first is sort of this tongue-in-cheek, kind of wry and almost sort of like condescending narrative voice toward our friends, the four critics.
Yeah.
And that's kind of fun and funny. And there's parts that are really, really funny. Like I was just looking at one where it was something about, they're talking about, the reception of Arcamboldi's work in the different countries. And it was, I'm not going to find it now, but it was something, it was like a whole like part by itself. And it was like decidedly, poor reception in the United Kingdom or something. I forget.
Page 38. Page 38. It goes through like the Spanish publishers and the rights to all the writers' books that are yet to be translated into Spanish were bought. And in this way, the Arcamboldi library was begun. In the British Isles, it must be said, Arcamboldi remained a decidedly marginal writer. And it's just really funny. So there's these parts that are just very tongue-in-cheek and very funny. And then we start to get the sense of like, there's the darkness is gathering, and it's gathering around the lives of the critics, and it's gathering also, I think, around the figure of Arcamboldi. So it's like, here's this great master. He's this sort of like unsung literary genius. They are doing their best to like bring attention to him. They're translators. There's some really funny little zingers in there about the poor pitiful translators. Yeah.
But Arcamboldi himself is like, you start to get the sense that he's this really, he's this mysterious character. Very few people have ever seen him or have met him. He's described sort of just like in terms of his physicality, that he's this sort of enormous giant of a man. He's described as wearing, like a Gestapo, long coat.
Yeah.
And so you're like, okay, so we're going to start with the Nazi references, like right off the bat.
Yeah.
And then there's building violence, like I said, sort of in the world of the critics, in their personal lives and in their dreams. And then there's also this sort of nagging sense that like, there's something kind of strange about the figure of this writer as well.
Yeah. How much? I think it's interesting that after last week we talked about the kind of myth of Lanyo and the creation of his backstory, and that is Arcamboldi here. Of like
Yeah.
they know nothing, they sort of create ideas of him. They get like vague references. There's a bit where like someone writes a story or article for a journal where it's simply like going through what tickets were bought or like what things they could actually find.
The Serbs
The
article.
Serb, yeah, the Serb, which is all of the
Serb.
presentations of like the country things are funny because even I have to say like I don't care for Liz's last boyfriend or the whatever his name is that's in here. But when he's like, well, German literature is a joke, I was like, fuck yeah, you're right on, buddy. German literature is a joke.
And they're like, what are you, just an ignoramus?
Yeah, exactly.
Let's take this outside.
What's that? Step outside, yeah.
They're like, you're just, an ignoramus. Let's take this outside. Well, on page 37 of the UK edition, it's this section about, I actually highlighted here and I wrote myth. And it talks about, okay. So the Archamboldians united this time, who, rather than being disheartened by the poor treatment that Archamboldi continued to receive, redoubled their efforts, galvanized in their frustration, and spurred on by the injustice with which a civilized state was treating not only, in their opinion, the best living writer in Germany, but the best living writer in Europe. And this triggered an avalanche of literary and even biographical studies of Archamboldi, about whom so little was known that it might as well be nothing at all, which in turn drew more readers, most captivated not by the German's work, but by the life or non-life, that's really interesting, of such a singular figure. So I guess again, like that interest in the unknown, and this was something that I wanted to mention in the last episode that we talked about after a little bit, was the idea of like, who are the heroes of literature right now, and who are they? Are they hiding under rocks, or are they on Instagram? And so the idea that like, what breeds this sort of like the fascination, the interest in the obsession, is how little is known, about this figure, as opposed to sort of like just a constant, in your face of all the details of this person's life and what they're reading and what they're eating, and and so I think that's kind of interesting too, to look at like, I guess our really contemporary moment, and how this is sort of like, this book is not that old, but it's old enough to sort of appear romantic in this way, sort of romanticizing the figure of the greats,
of the great artists. That's sort of like solitary, mysterious. It sort of calls back to the idea of inspiration, of like the genius. It's very German in the sense that German authors and translators of German seem to take German authors as having been like not divinely, but like heavenly inspired, and like doing something that's beyond their normal capabilities. The person that, so contemporarily, I don't know of anyone that's like this secretive or like off map, aside from like Elena Ferrante, which we talked about in the bonus part of this, and Nick. And then the other person that comes to mind immediately, though, and is very related to this, is Thomas Pynchon.
Right.
A Pynchon of like there is so much myth about like where he was in California, what he did. His voice is on The Simpsons, so he's like, around. He did do like the trailer for Inherent Vice for the book that Penguin published. He read the copy and did the thing. So, and everyone's like, is that him? Is that him? You're always like trying to speculate, is this guy? I've met someone who claims to have written a bus with Pynchon and talked to him about it. And it seems the story, if I tell you the whole thing, is kind of realistic, because they had kids at the same age in the same private school, and they crossed paths before. But most recently, Sarah Mesa's husband pointed out that there's finally a new picture of Pynchon that came out, in which when he went to vote. So similar to the article about like these little pieces, like use the dry cleaners. He buys these tickets. There are points in time in which you interface with the world, even if you're a recluse writer. Pynchon did it to vote, and of course someone's like, that's him. They saw this in the New York Post. He looks like a really old hippie with really crazy beard going on, like not what I was picturing at all. They'll blew up the myth. But yeah, the fact that there is a void at the center of their studies, that his biography is unknown. And I have to say, like in one sense, and you mentioned this in the show notes, Katie, and we can talk about it now if we want, is that his it never feels like we have a full bibliography of Arcamboli. They're always like, and then there's this book, they find this book, this thing happens, this might be his last novel. It feels like it's uncertain as to like what his whole list is, or like what his books are and what they're studying. And I think that that's kind of interesting too. So there's like a hole in the center of like what they're looking at, which is reflective of this book as a whole. And it's teaching you from the beginning that that's the structure that Blind is working with, tying back to what you said about the thing that we read from his manifesto about the infrarealist being like this space, this black space that might have things inside of it that we don't see, but that are still there and still exert an influence.
Yeah.
That's one of my non-questions. Hey, thanks. Welcome to the 2-month review.
Oh.
Nice. Oh.
No.
Well, he even mentions that in page 15, where it says, this is U.S. edition, but that there's not much of a bibliography, but then it mentions that Germany as well, and the rest of Europe, and even the United States, which likes vanished writers. Vanished writers or millionaire writers.
Yeah.
Or the legend of vanished writers.
Yeah. Like us.
But I think again, it goes back to what we were kind of saying at the beginning, where we see ourselves in the work and we're making these connections. We like making connections and we like figuring things out. And a vanished writer makes you unearth things and make connections. And that pursuit, I think, builds the myth and the lore where you keep wanting more and more and more.
Yeah.
Whereas
like somebody like Franzen, for instance, where if they're there and you've got them and they're always talking and they're always available, you see them everywhere. It's kind of like, I read your one book, I'm good now. I don't want to see you ever again.
Yeah.
Right? Speaking of Franzen, I highly recommend the podcast Mr. Difficult that Alex Shepard runs, in which it's like a gag as like what if Franzen were good. And also I want to point out that Franzen requested one of our books yesterday, and I mailed it to him without making a single joke or inserting anything negative into the pack.
You just saved all your jokes and cruelty for right now.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't ask us directly, and I think that there's a reason why. But like, nevertheless,
What book?
He wanted On Time and Water, of course.
Oh, of course.
Like, it's kind of like
birds in it.
It does.
Talk about birds and bird migrations and their habitats being
Did you mention like, the names of all those books? And there's a comment on here that the names of all of Arcamboli's books sound like they could double as Peter Greenaway movies, which is a good observation.
The leather mask.
Yeah, the leather mask.
Of the something gardens.
No, Railroad Perfection is my favorite.
Oh yeah, Railroad Perfection is awesome.
Railroad Perfection is awesome. And Bifurcatia, Bifurcatus, or something like that. That one is really funny too.
Yeah. It should be here. So here's the complete works. I'll read the complete works to you because I have, and I'll share this in the chat and in the show notes. The Invisible Library, which Ed Park and Levi Stahl, two friends that are very, very brilliant, started and put together of like a running list of made up books that appear in other books. So Arcamboli's are Bifurcata. the Berlin Underworld, Bitzius, The Blind Woman, which is the first one that Liz Norton reads, The Arson Ball, The Endless Rose, The Garden, Inheritance, The King of the Forest, Lethia, The Leather Mask, The Lottery Man, Mitzi's Treasure, Railroad Perfection, The Return, Rivers of Europe, and St. Thomas.
Mitzi's Treasure? All right.
Is Mitzi's Treasure the one that they compared to the Marquis de Sade and that they get all pissy about?
Oh, I don't know. I should be keeping a closer eye.
What's
that?
Oh,
That's really funny.
Yeah, so if you're ever looking for some fun times. Oh, but the thing that relates to that, you mentioned how you thought that was fun in the show notes. And the thing that first comes to mind, and this is so obvious and evident that it's kind of silly even to point out, is Borges is a survey of the works of Herbert Quain, which is his short story in which he writes about this author, Herbert Quain, who died in Roscommon and was never really, didn't get much attention as this unknown author. And Borges describes like how his books are designed and what the structure of them are. And the titles too are made up, like The God of the Labyrinth, The Siamese Twin Mystery, what's other, April March, in which he uses like one part and then there's 3 outcomes and then 3 outcomes from each of those parts. So you read it almost like a exploded idea.
Siamese twins.
The Secret Mirror. And what's the last one? Is this it? No, that's not Memphis Sales. I think The Secret Mirror
The
is the last
Garden
one.
of the Forking Path.
And the story, the guy, well, he says that that's how he wrote The Garden of the Forking Path, is based on Herbert Quain's, life and works. So this seems to like call right back to that for me. Of like, and it's interesting because there's a book that I want to write about for the Mine and Adelke Archive newsletter called 4 Cold Chapters on the possibility of literature, leading mostly to Borges and the Aleppo. And it talks a lot about that story and about the way in which Borges would reference things that you had to go to somewhere else to understand how to read that story. There's a really great ending to this, an appendix in which he breaks down the story. I forget what it is. It's been whatever in his labyrinth, in his something. Murdered in His Labyrinth, in which it's a murder mystery story in which you're told the mystery, you're given a solution, and then another character is like, that solution is wrong. Here's the right solution. However, Borges references in earlier stories and in writings that he always wanted to write a mystery story in which both of those are wrong. And only the reader can come back and figure out what the real answer to the mystery is. So there's this interesting interplay between like things that are real and things that are not. And these references in which the book is sort of teaching you how to view what's happening that I think shows up in these first 75 pages. And the Archamboldi made up titles are interesting to me because there are in here millions of authors and references that are real. So there's a lot that's real and a lot that's not, to the point where like the one that I wasn't sure about was Edwin Johns. If Edwin Johns is a real artist or not, because it describes the Docklands, it describes like where that is in London, all that's very true in terms of how that area developed, but then he's not real. But Arnold Schmitt's mentioned in here, which is a German author that probably nobody has read that's listening to this podcast. And is very, very obscure. And there's so many. There's like a billion different people that are referenced I circled throughout here that are real characters. Stela's mentioned.
Now, those German authors, were those real? Gunter Grass and
No.
Goethe?
No.
Goethe?
There is no literature from German.
I know you said there's no German literature.
My true argument is German literature is fine, but it's not funny.
Hermann Hesse?
It's never funny. It's never funny. German literature cannot be funny.
I have a question for you guys about sort of the figure of, well, I guess the idea of like mystery and the figure of like of the detective.
That's where I wanted to go.
Oh, okay, you go then. Go.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead, because
no, I mean, well, I'm just
right where I was
asking.
at. I'm vibing with you. Go for it.
Okay. Well, I'm just interested in this because obviously we know just from reading the back of the book that we're going to be getting to some sections about crime, and we know that it's a preoccupation in Bolaño's work as a whole, and there's a whole novel with the word detective in it. But I guess like I see these critics as when they start to talk to the Swabian, when they are like piecing together information from Mrs. Bubis, and they start to act like detectives as well. And so we see that they're really, they're diving into the work, they're theorizing, but then they become sort of obsessed with the figure, and they're on this hunt, on this mystery. And I'm just curious about like your thoughts on like what might Bolaño be saying about writing and mystery, reading and detectives?
I'll let you answer since you're thinking about it.
I don't know what he's saying necessarily, but I especially when they meet the widow, Mrs. Bubis, is where I really started leaning in, like, oh, this is a detective novel.
Yeah. And the last part is the part about Archamboldi.
Yeah,
so
it totally switched the like, oh, okay, this is fun. He's playing with some tropes here. This is dead on a detective. We're gonna go follow a lead. The lead goes nowhere.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with like Pynchon, with Inherent Vice, or with Crying or Vineland. Like, it's this weird postmodern detective novel.
I mean, so many of those go back to like the detective novels of Borges and Poe, and like their idea that like one of the things I think is coming up in here is that the detective impulse, so the impulse to be a detective or to understand something is inherent in so many things. And so it's in their intellectual endeavors of trying to figure out like the work itself, as if like with that part that I read as my fake professor, because I'm not a professor, about the literary criticism being where revolution can happen, ties in this academic belief that like by unpacking through a close reading of this text, we will illuminate something that will change things, which is a view that's not held by all academics and definitely not by like Moroni and people that I think of like as more interesting, but that is the traditional English studies, is like to read close and uncover something. And I think that with the detective nature in this, it's set up that like you're never going to find the answer.
Yeah.
They're never going to, there's the void is there in that there's no illumination of that way. There's acts. This is interesting. This is a weird transition, but I'm going to try it anyways. So Katie, you wanted to talk about the representation of Liz Norton within this. And I think that kind of ties in here. And I was editing this book Antagony this morning by Luis Guidasolo, which I've been editing for approximately 7 years and will never ever finish. And I'm this far away from losing my entire sense of self. But I hit this line, and I'm just going to read this. This is unedited. I just copy and pasted it because it was like the first thing I read. Okay, so just in this writer writing notes in his notebook about the frame for it is that he's talking about how you represent people that you know in fiction and people you don't know. And then it's much easier that if you don't know someone well to characterize them. The more you know them and know their like discordances and like differences, the harder it is to like represent them fully. So just as in the novels of chivalry, the knight is defined by his exploits. Being for a lady a characterization based on his qualities, exalted no less in the physical than in the spiritual realm. So even today, the woman is usually explained according to what she is, and the man according to what he does. The deformation is not only moral and cultural, but also specifically literary. In novels, for example, the characterization of the male protagonist is usually more prominent than the female, his key points written more coherently, his details more polished, more convincing. To my judgment, this is owing to the fact that while the female protagonist constitutes the unmistakable object of the story, the male protagonist is identified rather more with the goal through which the author develops that story, the lens through which he offers us the various vicissitudes of its development. And that finds fulfillment even when, lacking that protagonist viewer, the author supplants her implicitly, assuming the role of observing lens, the case of Madame Bovary, for instance, or when the author is a woman who, assuming the conventions belong to the genre, elaborates the characterization of her heroines the same as a man might do. In this sense, the female protagonist in the novel is usually more similar to the secondary characters than the male protagonist, something like an extensively developed secondary character, their characterization well-rounded, meticulous, efficiently defined, figures that might belong to, I don't know how to say that.
Oh my God, Chad.
More convex than concave, unlike the male protagonist, whose particular depth seems rather more the result of a tranquil emptying.
So what's the Reader's Digest of that?
Is that males are represented through their
what they
actions and what they do, and that females in novels are represented by who they are. And so in this case of when you brought up Liz Norton, that sort of plays out here of like she and the other secondary part of this is that the female characters are usually secondary characters in the male books and are served to be an object of the goal of the male protagonist, which Liz serves in this function as well in this part, and thus are rather less defined in the way that the male characters are. And related to that, I think that I don't remember if I'm right or wrong about this, but who, aside from Marini being in a wheelchair and Arcamboli being a big German, is there anyone else that's described physically?
Well, Liz Norton is described as having very pretty ankles.
Mm-hmm.
So TRA, ankles.
Yeah.
Yep.
Ankles.
Yeah.
Ankles are key.
No, I did like that there's no, I thought about that. And this goes back to our previous season. I loved when DuPont talked about how women are described in books, and they're of no use unless they're pretty. Why does a female character have to be pretty or captivating?
Yeah.
And I liked in this that there's no description of people, and it's more about what their pursuit is or what their goal or their desire is, and them going after it was the thing of interest.
Here's a good quote related to that. As John Berger puts it, men do, women appear.
Wow, nice.
I'm just going to talk about this paragraph and put that in there and call it good, because like book's fucking long, guys. It's 1,000 pages long
Brevity.
of that.
Brevity is the soul of wit.
You know,
But no, but that quote, or that was actually from King Kong Theory.
oh yeah,
That
yeah.
wasn't,
Yeah.
no, that wasn't but that was in King Kong Theory that she wrote that. And it was really challenging for me because I had to look back at how I treat women characters in my books. More often than not, they don't serve a purpose other than what my protagonist, if the protagonist is male, is what they're going after. I was like, wow, I got nailed to the wall on that one. I'm like, she's dead on.
That's also why I want to point out at the beginning that Katie is much more accomplished than either of us.
Correct. Yeah.
and therefore has done
That
more
as
than
well.
both of us. She
That
has
as well.
done more.
Well,
Here, we're the.
I'm not going to be that. I'm certainly not going to wade into that. But there's a couple things that I'd like to point out about the characterization of Liz that I thought were really interesting. And one was this. So she's described as like a lot more intuitive, like suggestible. She's a bit of a cipher to them. Like sometimes they'll like be trying to get a reaction from her, and she has a cold, frosty gaze, for example. The narrator even says at one point he describes what Pelletier's thinking at a certain moment, what Espinosa's speaking at a certain moment, and then he says, as for what Liz Norton was thinking, or as what passed through Liz Norton's head, it's better not to say.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, so now we know that the narrator is also withholding information from us. That's a separate point, but we can talk about that with the voice. But with Liz, when she's described, like when her academic style is described, she's not like a goal-oriented, driven person. When she's talked about like sort of how she is as a lover, it's that she's not a particularly inventive or passionate lover. She's just kind of like game for whatever, which has its pluses for Pelletier and Espinosa. But like,
was actually that was a track that was on the B side, I believe. Lionel Richie, Inventive Lover. It didn't come out though. It was too avant-garde. Hey, besides Archambaldi, there was one thing. Moriani, are we doing Pelletier or Pelletier?
Well, we can just. And are we doing Archambaldi or Archambaldi?
Archambaldi is how it's pronounced on the audiobook.
Okay. I'll do it all wrong then. Archambaldi, Morini, Pelletier, and Espinosa had in common. All three had iron wills. Actually, they had one other thing in common. We'll get to that later. Liz Norton, on the other hand, wasn't what one would ordinarily call a woman of great drive.
Yep.
And they're following that she had none of the attributes of the ambitious.
Right. And she's not a full professor. And that's also
she's not a real professor like us. But we should reach out to her.
But she is 26 and she like lights up their life.
Yeah.
And she has pretty ankles. They do think that they do find her brilliant, and like she savages some other critic, in an argument, which is what draws them to her in the first place. But there's this element of either like unknowability about her, or I guess that's kind of what I mean about calling her like a cipher. Is that they want and also when I say they, I mean her lovers, her lover friends, and they want answers from her. They want a position from her, and she's not willing to make that either, which is interesting. There's one thing that I want to point out in relation to Liz, and then we can move on. But it was the part in Marini's dream, when he has the dream. Where is that? I put that in the show notes too.
It is on page, I want to say 45. Yeah, 45.
Okay, so all right, so Liz and Pelletier. I'm saying Pelletier because I'm from New Hampshire, and that's how we pronounce the French Canadian.
Dude, we say Charlotte here, so
Charlotte.
So I'm losing my place here.
45.
That's on
wait, I need to find the dream, guys.
It's 45 at the top.
Okay, but not in mine. Not in mine. All right. Would you want to read?
Very bottom
45,
of it begins near the end of 1996. Marini had a nightmare.
Okay.
He dreamed that Norton was diving into a pool as he, Pelletier, and Espinoza played cards around a stone table. Espinoza and Pelletier had their backs to the pool, which seemed at first glance to be an ordinary hotel pool. As they played, Marini watched the other tables, the parasols, the deck chairs lined up along both sides of the pool. In the distance, there was a park with deep green hedges, shining as if with fresh rain. Little by little, people began to leave, vanishing through the different doors connecting the outdoor space, the bar, and the building's rooms or little suites. Suites that Marini imagined consisted of a double room with kitchenette and bathroom. Soon there was no one left outside, not even the bored waiters he'd seen earlier bustling around. Pelletier and Espinoza were still absorbed in the game. Next to Pelletier, he saw a pile of poker chips, as well as coins from various countries, so I guess Pelletier was winning. And yet Espinoza didn't look ready to give up. Just then, Marini glanced at his cards and saw he had nothing to play with. He discarded and asked for 4 cards, which he left face down on the same stone table without looking at them, and with some difficulty, he set his wheelchair in motion. Pelletier and Espinoza didn't even ask where he was going. He rolled the wheelchair to the edge of the pool. Only then did he realize how enormous it was. It must have been at least 1,000 feet wide and more than 2 miles long, calculated Marini. The water was dark, and in some places there were oily patches, the kind you see in harbors. There's no trace of Norton. Marini shouted, "Liz!"
Okay, wait.
Yeah, go.
Okay. I don't know if we have to read the whole section.
I thought that your section was in this part, but then I flipped the page. It wasn't.
You just jumped right in there, and we have a long ways to go. No, but thank you, Chad, for setting that up so nicely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll go fuck myself in the other room for a while.
No, that's great, because so here's the dream. Like it's sort of strange. You see the guy, they're playing some sort of game. There's different coins from different countries. Pelletier seems to be winning. Liz dives into the pool, and then Marini doesn't see her anymore. So he looks into the pool. He sees down deep in the depths a little figure, but he can't make out who the figure is, right? And it looks like they're trying to kind of scramble out. And then suddenly he feels this presence behind him in the dream. And it's a bad vibe. It's a bad presence. It's some sort of evil, and it wanted Marini to turn around and see its face. Okay, so he backs around. He carefully turns, and he looked into the stranger's face, controlling his fear, a fear all the worse for his dawning certainty that he knew the person following him, who gave off a stench of evil that Marini could hardly bear. In the fog, Liz Norton's face appeared. A younger Norton, 20 if that, staring so seriously and intently that Marini had to look away. Then who was the person at the bottom of the pool? Marini could still see him or her, a tiny speck trying to climb out, etc., etc. And then we have this reference to Gustave Moreau. It looks like a painting by Gustave Moreau. Then he swung around to face Norton, and she said, "There's no turning back." He heard the sentence not with his ears, but in his head. Norton has acquired telepathic powers, Marini thought. She isn't bad, she's good. It isn't evil that I sensed, it's telepathy, he told himself to alter the course of a dream that in his heart of hearts, he knew was fixed and inevitable.
Okay,
go
ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I want to tie this back because I hadn't realized I had circled parts of that and read your reference to it, and hadn't noticed this until you were just reading it. But the reference to Gustave Moreau and Liz's juxtaposition here and the cover of this book seems to apply like the sense of like, we want as a reader, as an investigator, as a person to experience the divine. So we want to experience Zeus or Jupiter like fucking us totally. And we are destroyed in the process, and yet give birth to Dionysus, the god of joy and all of that. But it destroys us. And there's kind of that idea with the Archibaldi detectiveness, and with the sense of like even Liz, where you say she's a cipher, of wanting to know the full thing and have that full divine revelation. But the divine revelation is always dangerous.
So what is it then what do we make here of this sort of, if we're just going to take that the dream is sort of some sort of unconscious, subconscious thought or feeling, and on Marini's part, like what is it about Liz that represents a threat or that is evil?
Am I sticking with the same beat that I've had this whole time as my motif is that she's unknowable to them.
And that makes her a problem.
And so like, well, it also relates weirdly to the part that you haven't mentioned, which is also like kind of creepy and unnerving, of where Liz is referred to as Medusa,
Right.
who's
Yeah.
mortal and bad and will destroy you. Like
Right,
her-
and that's what
time.
her friend Pritchard says to the other two critics, like, watch out, watch out for her.
Oh, that misery line.
The
Upon meeting her, he
oh
would-
yeah,
the misery,
suffering.
Yeah.
So Espinoza, flying back on the plane, is like, where to go?
If he was only
Here it
pursuing
is.
the mystery of Archambault, he would have been fine. Archambault, but no, Liz is there now. So
Espinoza experienced something similar, though slightly different. By the time he was on the plane, he realized that she was the perfect woman, one he'd always hoped to find, and he began to suffer. So he's suffering, the suffering Spanish academic lover. Is where, yeah. So she's got that. Well, you've referenced before that the part about the crimes is like the vortex, or the part that sort of everything swirls around. And I have a question about that in a second, but there's a number of these spaces
Right.
that are cracked and like are destructive in the end, like a black hole, like a sense of like you can go into it so far. And we'll see this when we get to Santa Teresa. And I don't want to spoil or make too much of a heavy emphasis on that section at this moment in time. But is that the more you try and understand, the less understandable it is.
Right.
Like, how can you fathom? How can you justify or rationalize what happens in Juarez / Santa Teresa? And related to that, there is a reference possibly to Santa Teresa. I wasn't sure if it was the same or not, but on page 43, around this time, Marini was the first of the four to read an article about the killings in Sonora, which appeared in Il Manifesto and was written by an Italian reporter who had gone to Mexico to cover the Zapatista guerrillas. The news is horrible, he thought. In Italy, there were serial killers too, but they hardly ever killed more than 10 people, whereas in Sonora, the dead numbered well over 100. And I assume that's a reference to Santa Teresa, although it wouldn't match where Juarez is.
And I don't know, but what I don't know is if we know that like Santa Teresa is sort of the fictionalization of Juarez, but I don't know if it's located in the exact same geographical spot as Juarez.
Yeah.
Because it could be because the Sonora
it's
Desert does border the United States, but further west.
further west than where Juarez is. Yeah, I assume that is, and it goes on to say that the reporter didn't really go there; she just reported on it. So it's like kind of an interesting moment of like a lead into what's going to happen later in a few different instances, but like is one of those like references to that pops up in here. We've been talking for a while. The one thing, what was I going to transition to? Dude, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought because I was reading the comments. Don't know. Oh, I do know. The thing I didn't understand is the story from the woman about Buenos Aires and the horse races. I don't know why that's in this book, or like why it's in that section that way. Like we have the Schwabian saying like, I met Arcamboldi, he came to this place, we had this dinner with this woman who used to be elegant, and she's like went to Buenos Aires with her husband. He raced horses 3 times against this horse owner, won each time. The little kid was, I think maybe the reason it's there is that the last racer is like pissed and violent and is like wants to like destroy. And it's another instance of the violence that creeps up in here. But I just don't get that section. I don't know if I'm just missing something obvious or if it's not really important, but it was it was the first one that I hit that was so long in comparison to all these other little short sections about the critics. And then you hit this and it's like, why this, why now, and why this long? Why this much detail about the story that then changes later? Is it just that it's that it might not be real and that the Schwabian is inventing stories the way that we invent stories to have things happen? But she asked in the middle, can you solve this riddle? And I thought it's interesting.
I mean, I don't know if this is correct. And I know that you've told me many times, don't worry about being right. You don't have to be right about
There's no right.
You can just say anything you want.
Yeah.
But something that comes to mind for me is Bolaño's location as a writer in Europe, but his condition, and he called it his condition of being a Latin American writer. So I think that this story starts to be the bridge for us to the action that will take place in on the other continent. Well, one of the other continents. This is just an idea. I mean, I think there's parts in this section where they talk about sort of like the Creole. So the idea, it says on page 20, my page 21, almost like down like the bottom quarter. And she even saw, this is the widow, the young widow in the memory, even saw a fountain in the park, a stone fountain, in the center of which, balanced on one little foot, a Creole cherub with smiling features danced, part European and part cannibal, perpetually bathed by 3 jets of water, etc. So the idea that we're starting to introduce that that violence is present everywhere, but there's a particular type of violence between Europe or the European, like colonizing. This to me is all like colonial. This whole section is so colonial, you know, and it's the little gaucho, and that she's like, oh, you know, you poor little lamb. It's the Germans that are going to, you know, to go on the ranch. So I think that's part of what's being done here is making reference to that trope, in a sense, like the European trope of like the savage new world and the colonies. I also think that I don't understand what is the riddle. Is the riddle like, it doesn't really seem like a riddle. It just seems more like a question. Like, why did he win the first race? And then Arcamboldi's response, it just seems really like kind of inane.
Yeah.
Not riddle-ish at all.
Exactly. That's why I was like, what is this? Like, what am I missing here? Because that feels off.
I feel like it was speaking to the relationship between Europe and the quote New World,
which is what you were saying,
right,
Katie, and like the idea that there is like this undercurrent of violence that's also deferential, that is forced to be deferential. Like they're told to lose, according to Arcamboldi, they're told to lose the last 2 races on purpose.
Or like, you think you're winning, but we're letting you win.
We're letting you win.
And you're not as smart as you think you are.
Right.
So I also want to put on page 60, I want to say hello to Rodrigo Frazan, who pops up in this book, like randomly. And the first time I read this, I would never have known this was who this was.
Do we know it's actually Rodrigo Frazan?
Does it matter?
I mean, his name is Rodrigo, and he wrote a book called Kensington Gardens. But go ahead. Let's try this theory out.
There's a man, they're in Kensington Gardens by the Peter Pan statue, and there's a man beside this woman who's tall, had a beard and a mustache, and pulled out a notepad out of his pocket and jotted something down. Then he said out loud, Kensington Gardens. The woman wasn't looking. They talked for a second. Then the woman called to the man, Rodrigo, come see this, she said. The man answered him not to hear. He had put the little notepad away in a pocket of his leather jacket and was gazing silently at the statue of Peter Pan. All of this is literally a part of Kensington Gardens by Rodrigo Frazan. So it's a fun little interlude, and that's where I started focusing on like the real and not real in here, and how, like Borges, pulls things from other places to get you in. It's what made the TV show Lost interesting when Lost was on, was that there were things that were real that were referenced within the context of an imaginary show, and that giving you that idea, like Savage Detectives does this. What parts of that are real characters and what parts of that are imaginary is a fun game to like play through. So
well, and also, and it's not just the dichotomy of real and imaginary, but it's like real figures or real people with made up names, and so like you're mapping the imaginary onto the real too, and then it's sort of like what does it matter?
But you've studied this. How much of this is a Romana clef? I think that's what you were asking earlier before we started. Of like, are these stand-ins for any individual people, or are these just inventions?
The whole book, or like
the whole book? This is a question that can't be answered right now. But it's Savage Detectives that feels like that's more of the case. And in here, I don't see it quite as much yet, but I don't doubt that there are critics that are in mind. Like and Bolaño writing from a point of like not having been accepted by the Academy, about an author who is increasingly and gets accepted by the Academy through like the obsession of these 4 people is an interesting thing, a perspective to write from.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose we should sort of wrap this up, but we should mention too that this ends on like a real intense note in which the 3 of them, Pelletier, Espinosa, and Norton, are in a cab with a Pakistani driver. They're talking about jealousy. They're kind of like potential menage a trois / like poly loving relationship. And the Pakistani cab driver gets pissy, calls her a whore, calls the 2 men pimps, and Espinosa jumps out. So they stop the cab, jumps out, pulls him out of the cab, and kicks the fucking shit out of him, as does Pelletier. And they compare it to like having orgasms and like a sexual experience of just kicking the shit out of him, as Norton's like upset. And also it does reference that she felt it like is an off screen thing, but she felt like she had also like had a series of multiple orgasms. Norton, who was staring at them without seeing them in the dark, seemed to have experienced multiple orgasms. And they leave him, they take his car and leave him there, and then are like anxious about it the next day, but partially for his sake, but partially because they don't want Liz to be pissed at them in a way.
Yeah.
But they also they don't regret it necessarily.
No, and this is really interesting. And I think this is such a critical like turning point, because there has been sort of these hints toward violence. I mean, you've had like Pelletier, when Pelletier imagines that Espinosa's plane has gone down in flames.
Yes.
When, you know, there's like little moments like that. It's like,
I mean, that's a Borges thing too, is that if you imagine or see something in specific detail, it can't actually happen. If you can imagine it, because if you imagine it, nothing will happen the way you imagined it. It has to be different.
And there is a plane crash.
And there is a plane crash.
There is a plane crash, but and it's not him. But Espinosa and Pelletier spend a lot of time in this first section, like just congratulating themselves on being so civilized and such good friends, and they only want the best for Liz. Like they want to screw Liz, but they really want to marry Liz and have babies with her, and all they want is for everything to sort of be intact. Yeah. But everything's coming unraveled. And so I wonder if Marini's dream too foreshadows some of this, and that what does like this feminine figure do to the group as a whole? And like, and I guess one of my questions in our show notes was like I can see that reading of Liz in this, and I'm like, it just seems kind of tired to like paint the woman as this sort of like wrecking ball force that's going to come between the 2 men and like produce this violence that is like a sexual release. And so I'm curious, and I mean, I'm saying this, I have read everything, but I am curious about tracing a little bit the portrayal of the feminine and the female and female characters in this book, and just sort of getting a sense of like, well, what is Bolaño doing here? Like, are there going to be places where he's like setting this up only to subvert it later? I hope so, because on the surface, it just sort of seems right now like, you know, Liz is the intuitive one. She's kind of unknowable. Men fall in love with her, then it leads them to violence. You know, what's happening between, like, basically like the relationship between the men, this closeness and this camaraderie and this like brotherhood, all is carried out like through the body of Liz in the end. And when Liz cools things off with them is when things start to get violent, like when there isn't that outlet with her. So I'm just curious about how that might tie in to like the treatment of the crimes later. So anyway, that's my piece.
That's a good teaser.
Yeah, he feels, it reads and it feels too smart for that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I know.
I don't want to be disappointed if that's all it is.
I suspect that it isn't.
I agree.
But like stopping on page 75, like if that's all there And you'd be like, like, okay, like we're going to reference like the Greeks and Medusa, and she's, you know, she's an angel, she's this, but she's also evil. And it's sort of like, okay, well, yeah, we've seen this before.
Yep.
So I'm wondering what will happen with that.
Well, there's two. There's the Merry Maiden and the Scorned Woman.
Mm-hmm.
And she's a little bit of both to them.
And the first book she reads is The Blind Woman.
Right, as a divorcee, but also as a muse for them. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing too that I thought was interesting is that she says basically she's like, I mean, I think Liz is very sexually liberated, and that where she's just kind of unfazed. It appears that she's sort of unfazed with it all, unfazed by it all, and says, you know, she's like, I've had a lot of friends, and they're like, well, does she mean friends or does she mean lovers? She's like, I've had a lot of friends ever since I was like 16 and slept with 35-year-old, and then, you know, Pelletier tries to like impress her with his long list of lovers, and she's just sort of like stares at him like coldly.
Bibliography,
exactly. Bibliography.
Oh dear. So, okay, so we can wrap up here. Do you have a favorite line? I didn't mark one this time. Does anyone want to go first while I sketch through?
I do have one, and I'll find it.
Not a whole passage, though. I don't want to
listen to you read for 5 minutes.
Okay, it is kind of a long passage, but I'm going to start.
No, I'm just kidding.
No, I know, but I want to start like on like the page before, like 4 or 5 paragraphs before, and just read all of that as well.
Okay.
Oh my God. Okay.
Kidding. I'm kidding. That's what you did. Okay.
Okay, let's keep pointing out how I fucked that up. and just note that I can totally cut that from the audio version and nobody will.
No one's gonna know what's happening. Okay. I'm trying to find mine too, guys. Somebody else can go if they're ready. No? Okay, here it is. Page 29. In a word, and bluntly, as they walked around St. Pauli, it came to Pelletier and Espinosa that the search for Arcimboldi could never fill their lives. They could read him, they could study him, they could pick him apart, but they couldn't laugh or be sad with him, partly because Arcimboldi was always far away, partly because the deeper they went into his work, the more it devoured its explorers. In a word, in St. Pauli and later at Mrs. Bubis's house, hung with photographs of the late Mr. Bubis and his writers, Pelletier and Espinosa understood that what they wanted to make was love, not war.
Solid.
All right, here's mine. It's on page 43.
God, hurry.
So this is after Morini had read about the article in Il Manifesto, this wonderful, intrepid Italian reporter that's uncovering these hundreds of women that are being mutilated. I'd love her until the end of time, he thought. An hour later, he'd already forgotten the matter completely.
The one that I had marked was we already did, but I'll just go back to it unless I find something else really fast. Was in the British Isles, it must be said, Arcimboldi remained a decidedly marginal writer. That's totally
good.
I like decidedly
marginal.
Maybe we could do this next week, but I want to talk about what does it mean to be a decidedly marginal writer.
I love it too. It's such a good phrase. So anyway, so next week we'll be going over through the end of part 1 about the critics. And if you're listening to the audio version, you'll now hear an interview with Nick Buzansky, short conversation. But everyone else or anyone else, or even if you're listening to it, who cares? Rate, review us, tell your friends, listen to the podcast. Hope you enjoy what we're doing here. And we'll be back next week with more conversations about academics and representation of female academics in 2666. Anyone got a final thought?